Thomas Tate Tobin solidified himself as a legend of the West when he was tasked to hunt down some of the West's first serial killers, the Bloody Espinosas. Tobin served as their grim reaper with his jet black hair, dressed all in black from head to toe, riding a black horse with a black saddle, and for a sickle, Tobin carried a 15-pound, 53 caliber Hawken rifle that reached to his shoulders. Tom Tobin was born in 1823 in St. Louis, Missouri. Much of his early life is unknown, but when he was 14, he began working alongside his half-brother Charles Audeby as a beaver trapper. We learned more about Tom when he began work at Simon Turley's store, mill, and distillery down in the New Mexico territory. He spent much of his time delivering supplies and whiskey to trappers in exchange for furs. On January 19, 1847, Tom Tobin would find himself caught in the middle of Hispanic and Pueblo insurrectionists revolting against the United States. This would be known as the Taos revolt. The revolt began when a force led by Tomas Romero stormed the home of Governor Charles Bent. Bent was shot several times with arrows, then scalped in front of his wife and kids. The insurrectionists quickly moved through the town of Taos, killing and scalping several government officials along the way. The next day, a force of 500 Mexican and Pueblo men began to advance on their next target, the Simon Turley Mill and Distillery, where Tom Tobin was currently working. Charles Audeby, seeing the advancing force, quickly rode off to Santa Fe to seek reinforcements. This left Tom Tobin and 10 other men to defend the mill. The men were able to hold the force off for only a day. Once night arrived, many men were already dead or wounded when the attackers set fire to the mill. Only 2 occupants were able to escape, Tom Tobin and Johnny Albert. Tom Tobin and Charles Audeby would go on to serve as scouts for the United States military and help track down the remaining insurrectionists and bring them to justice. Lieutenant Colonel William Gilpin spoke highly of Tom and stated that Tobin could track a grasshopper through sagebrush. Some even said his skills surpassed the legendary Kit Carson in tracking and shooting. By 1863, Tom Tobin was living a relatively peaceful life on his ranch near Fort Garland, when a soldier rode out to deliver an urgent request to stop the Bloody Espinosas. In March of 1863, brothers Felipe and Vivian Espinosa would begin their reign of terror throughout the Colorado region. Their first victim, Franklin Bruce, was found dead, his body stripped naked and mutilated with a large cross carved into his chest. 2 days later, the second victim, Henry Hawkins, was found dead, shot through the forehead. His head was also split open with an axe. The Bloody Espinosas would continue to claim 25 more victims. Some were found with stick crucifixes shoved into the victims' foreheads. The 1st Cavalry was dispatched to bring an end to these killings, but with no leads and no witnesses, their search was in vain. It wasn't until April 25th, when Edward Metcalf was riding his wagon east to Fairplay, when a shot rang out. The bullet hit Edward in the chest, knocking him backwards into the wagon. Edward's life was spared by a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation, which, when folded up in his chest pocket, was enough to stop the bullet. The frightened oxen continued to bolt down the road, carrying Edward out of harm's way. During his retreat, Edward managed to look up and see the Espinosas emerge from behind the trees. He was able to give a detailed description of the attackers to the local authorities, and a posse was quickly assembled and rode out to find the brothers. On May 8th, the posse found the Espinosas' camp. Vivian, upon seeing the posse, moved quickly to free the pair's horses from their post. He was quickly shot and knocked to the ground. As he reached for his revolver, another posse member landed a shot square between his eyes. Felipe, seeing his brother's death, quickly fled into the brush, escaping capture. On the remains of Vivian were personal papers revealing the name of the 2 serial killers. The newspapers quickly named the 2 the Bloody Espinosas. After Vivian's death, the murder stopped. Many believe that Felipe had either retired from his murderous ways or succumbed to the elements. Unfortunately, neither one of these rumors were true, for in October of the same year, the murders continued. Felipe had enlisted his 14-year-old nephew, Jose Vicente Espinosa, as his accomplice, and the pair began their murderous ways once more. It was at this time Tom Tobin was summoned. On October 18th, Tobin set out on the trail with 15 troopers to assist in the pursuit. They began their search at the last known sighting of the Espinosas. Tobin began making ever-widening circles around the crime scene. sometimes on all fours, head low to the ground. It didn't take long for Tobin to identify a pair of tracks from two ponies leading off in one direction. The following day, the group was forced to split up to follow several intersecting trails left by wild ponies. 7 men stuck with Tobin as he continued to follow tracks through the rough terrain. Tobin would often crawl on his knees through thick brush to keep on the trail. The next day, the search would provide no results, and it wasn't until the 4th day when Tobin found the trail again. While searching near a creek, Tobin discovered tracks left behind from 2 oxen. Seeing one oxen roaming free, he deduced that the Espinosas were driving the other oxen along with them to keep as a source of food. After following the tracks a short distance, Tom Tobin spotted birds circling in the sky. He informed the others that he believed the Espinosas had killed the oxen and had made camp just ahead. The timber was too thick to continue on horseback, so Tobin informed his group to stay low and to not make a sound or fire their guns. After crawling for 100 yards, Tobin was able to position himself behind a fallen log and laid eyes on the camp. He quickly spotted Felipe Espinosa tending to the campfire, with the carcass of the ox hanging in a nearby tree. Jose was out of view, for he was tending to the ponies down the ravine. Tobin watched patiently as Felipe stood up, walked over to the ox, cut a steak, and returned to cook on his fire. In Tom Tobin's own words, he said, "At this time I stepped on a stick and broke it. Felipe heard it crack and saw me. He jumped and grabbed his gun. Before he turned around fairly, I fired and hit him in the side. He bellowed like a bull and cried out, 'Jesus favor me,' and cried to his companion, 'Escape, I am killed.'" Felipe slumped face down into the fire, singeing his whiskers before he could roll out, while Jose bolted from the ravine toward a distant aspen grove. Tobin said, "I tipped my powder horn in my rifle, dropped a bullet from my mouth into the muzzle of my gun while I was capping it." Tobin shouted in Spanish for Jose to stop, but young Espinosa instead turned and fired at the tracker, missing wide. The teen had again broken into a run when Tobin fired, striking him in the small of his back. Jose dropped dead with a shattered spine. Felipe still clung to life as the group advanced toward the camp. Tobin said, "I had run down to where he was. I spoke to him and asked if he knew me. I told him who I was." As the groups moved up, Felipe hissed "brutos," which translates as brutes. Felipe then fired his revolver wildly. Tobin quickly disarmed him, grabbed him by his hair, dragged him over to a log, and with his knife severed the elder Espinosa's head. He then had the head of Jose Espinosa removed from his shoulders to serve as identification. The group left the bodies as they laid. Tobin tossed the heads into a gunny sack, tied it to his horse, and returned back to Fort Garland. Upon Tobin's return, Colonel Tappan asked if he had any luck. Tobin tossed the gunny sack at his feet, and as the heads rolled out, simply replied, "So-so."